What we haven't got, either in a chancellor or in a prime minister or in some, unelected person in either department, is a big figure essentially driving the economic strategy. And, there is nobody, as far as but given that so much of this rather disappointing industrial strategy was generated in the Treasury, right? In previous mediocre chancellors sort of delegated economic management to the Treasury. That, if that is happening at the moment, and I'm not sure it is, but if that is happening at the moment, that is part of the reason for the mediocrity. Keir Starmer cannot rely on the Treasury to make up for whatever the perceived shortcomings of his chancellor are.
Okay.
So he has to find somebody, right, either a new chancellor or just some other big figure to bring all this together and give an economic purpose to the government. This is the big flaw in this government, that it has no economic purpose.
I was kind of interested in your view on the fiscal rules. What are either Rachel Reeves's, or if you're right and she's just too locked in to do it, what is the choice of the next chancellor, assuming we have a new chancellor, in terms of the fiscal rules, given that, of course, what makes everyone, including people in government, nervous is that the markets start to turn against you, because we all know what happens when you get into that bind.
So I would do it in two phases. I would recognise that I don't have a coherent growth plan yet. And I would start by, putting every bit of government on notice that if they cannot demonstrate how incremental spending is, essentially going to improve the performance of the economy, return on investment, productivity, ultimately living standards, then they got to go back to the drawing board, right? Now, obviously, there's some crumbling infrastructure, there's some crumbling public services that, because, the long shadow of austerity stuff that needs to be fixed. But in general, this is a government that has to get into the mindset of nothing is possible without growth, because it is the growth that generates the incremental tax revenues, right? So you start with that, and if you do it under the kind of leadership which they probably don't have at the moment, which is why I said this issue about who is chancellor or who is the leader of this operation is so central, you then can start talking to the nation's creditors in a compelling way about essentially why this is a country that is worth backing, because there's a whole series of initiatives that are going on that are going to be making us better off, right? Now, when you start with that, it then becomes easier to have a grown-up discussion, again with these investors, about being more flexible around the fiscal rules. So one of the things, there are just a number of things that you could change. One of the things you could change is, at the moment, I just think this is bonkers, right? You would have the OBR assessing the health of the economy or the health of public economies once a year, not twice. One of the reasons why the Chancellor is in this hole is that she decided for the spring statement that the OBR was going to assess essentially, where the deficit and debt were going. And that's why she was forced into this crazy decision to ask or to order the Welfare Department to come up with these disability savings. It would have been so much better to delay all the reform of welfare in the round to the budget this coming autumn. And at that point, they might well have still come up with some quite painful recommendations or indeed policies for how to reform eligibility for personal independence payment. But on the assumption, which I think is a reasonable one, that they would also have announced the abolition of the two-child limit on universal credit, they would also have had a very positive story to have told about how they were lifting large numbers of low-income families and vulnerable children out of poverty. simultaneous with a reform that obviously is never going to be painless. But if you do it as the package as a whole, then you broadly say, you stick, I suppose what you're doing here as a Labour government is you are showing that the values of the Labour Party are intact, and it is an anti-poverty party. But they didn't do a comprehensive reform of that sort. They did it piecemeal, and they created all this mistrust. So that's one reform you would do, which is to have, as I say, simply the one event for the OBR every year to make this kind of assessment. But the other thing that you really ought to do is, she did change the debt rule, right? She basically changed, I felt that she wasn't radical enough in the way that she changed the debt rule. I think that there was a way of changing it that would have actually reduced the restrictions on the way that the government invests in productivity enhancing infrastructure more than her reforms have actually achieved. I think there needs to be more investment in whether it's capital, this is government-led investment in capital or infrastructure, to get, as I say, the productive base of this country up higher. She went for a halfway house, but she's not even exploiting this halfway house sufficiently. And then there's a final thing, which is the other fiscal rule, which is the real constraint, is she signed up to an unbelievably constraining limit on day-to-day spending. Basically, she put in place this requirement that day-to-day spending, and that's the enormous amounts that the government spends on wages and running costs, that by the end of this Parliament, 28-29, every penny of that has to be covered by tax revenues. You cannot borrow a penny for day-to-day spending. And then, actually earlier than that, but just because of the technicalities of the rolling programme, basically she put in place a rule that says on a rolling 3-year basis, the books always have to be balanced, right? This is nuts, right? Particularly at a time, when you've got a creaking public service. This is way too constraining. And look, if you weren't balancing by 1 percentage point of GDP in either direction in 3 years' time, do I think that the world would fall apart, that investors would dump the pound, dump gilts, refuse to lend to the government? No, not at all. But if you've at the same time proved that the investment bit of your spending, the non-day-to-day, is increasing the growth rate and increasing the productive potential of the economy, then actually investors are going to say plus or minus 1% in terms of day-to-day spending. That's fine.